Good afternoon. The 4-week lockdown in England, which will start on Thursday and is scheduled to end on December the 2nd, could be extended. The Cabinet Minister Michael Gove said ministers will be guided by the facts. He told the BBC the government wanted to get the coronavirus reproduction rate below the critical level of 1. Boris Johnson announced the latest round of restrictions at a news conference last night. Strict measures are set to come into effect this Thursday. They'll see pubs, restaurants, gyms and non-essential shops and places of worship close. However, schools, colleges and universities can remain open. Travel and overnight stays in the UK and abroad will be restricted, and meeting others indoors or in private gardens will be banned. Well, today Labour criticised the government for rejecting its call last month for a so-called circuit breaker, a tight set of restrictions for a fixed period of time. For the latest, here's our political correspondent, Helen Catt.
They're the headlines the Prime Minister never wanted to see, arriving at his own door this morning. England will go into a second national lockdown from Thursday. It should end on the 2nd of December. One of the government's most senior ministers indicated that was the hope, but not a guarantee.
If we ensure that all the steps that we're taking now are taken appropriately, we'll have an opportunity in advance of December the 2nd to review the progress that we're making, and in advance of December the 2nd, we can then communicate to those areas where some restrictions may be required, what they will be, and also other areas where we've managed to beat back the virus, we can explain where liberties can be restored.
Labour will back the new lockdown in a vote in Parliament this week with a degree of frustration.
If what they announced yesterday had been announced when I said it should have been 2 or 3 weeks ago, we could have had the lockdown and schools shut because of the natural break of half term. And people will be waking up this morning and thinking, how on earth did it get to this?
He warned the government needs to use the time wisely.
The government has to keep its side of the bargain here, because if they don't use this time to fix, test, trace and isolate, then I think the 2nd of December will be a review date, not an end date, because for months and months and months, they've promised a world-beating test, trace and isolate system, which is vital. If you don't test, you can't trace. If you don't trace, you can't isolate. It's been busted for months. Use the time to fix it, because otherwise we're going to be back in this cycle for months and months and months.
Particularly, he said, to keep schools open, a government commitment with which he agrees, and which is the big difference between the new lockdown for England and what happened in the spring. That may not be possible, one of the government's scientific advisers has warned, and he cast doubt on their plans to return to regional restrictions after lockdown.
What mustn't happen is whenever that date comes, 2nd of December or a little bit later, that suddenly the world goes back to normal. It's not going to go back to normal immediately. I think it will be at least what is currently called Tier 3 or Tier 3 plus across the country. I don't think it makes sense to go back into regional variation in the restrictions that are in place immediately after this set of more draconian measures are lifted.
In Leeds, they had been due to move into Tier 3 restrictions anyway, but these people seem OK with tougher national measures.
Obviously, rather it not happen, but if it means that the virus reduced, I'm all for it.
It feels sudden, but at the same time, we kind of expected it.
If it's necessary, it's necessary. I mean, long term, it's got to be done, hasn't it?
The new lockdown will be debated in Parliament this week. Expect more questions over how and when it will end, even before it's begun.
And Helen is with me now. Important parliamentary vote on all of this during the course of the coming week. A lot of Conservative MPs expressing disquiet.
Yeah, there is a lot of concern on the Conservative backbenches, and I think any indication that that December the 2nd date is likely to slip is unlikely to help with that, because there are several Conservative MPs who think that a second lockdown will just be too destructive to the economy, and they worry that there isn't an end game, a strategy for getting out of lockdown and staying out. There are those, of course, as well who say, well, if you're going to restrict people's liberties in this massive way, you have to have a really compelling case. Now, Boris Johnson clearly thinks he has that because of the data. In a message to Tory MPs last night, he said he would make that data available to them. He would allow them to have briefings with scientists over the coming days. But there is a wider sense of frustration in the party at the moment too about the way that the government has been handling this in general. So I think we might see quite a lot of spiky scenes in the Commons over the coming days.
Helen Catt, our political correspondent, thanks very much. The second lockdown has been prompted by rapidly rising infection rates in many parts of England. Our health correspondent Lauren Moss has been looking at the data.
Preparing for a second national lockdown. From Thursday, the message in England will once again be stay home to save lives. Non-essential shops and hospitality will close. Schools and universities will stay open. But some scientists think further measures may be needed to stop the spread of the virus.
We know that transmission, particularly in secondary schools, is high. Personally, I think this is definitely the lockdown to put in place now. But if that transmission, particularly in secondary schools, continues to rise, then that may have to be revisited in the next 4 weeks.
According to the Office for National Statistics' latest household survey, infection rates vary across the UK. In Northern Ireland, 1 in 80 people is estimated to have COVID-19. In Scotland, it's 1 in 140. In Wales, it's 1 in 120. And in England, the average is 1 in 100. But in the North West, it's 1 in 43. And the South East, it's 1 in 220 people. The Prime Minister says the measures are to prevent the NHS being overwhelmed, which would be a medical and moral disaster. Currently, there are more than 9,000 people with COVID-19 in English hospitals. Almost 500 are on ventilators.
Well, I think the Prime Minister had no choice but to act on very clear evidence that the trajectory of hospital admissions, demand of the health service was such that we just would have been overwhelmed in the coming weeks, to the point that it wouldn't just be a case of not managing the surge in patients with COVID, but actually the NHS would not have been able to provide services to large numbers of non-COVID patients.
Rapid testing has been pointed to as one of the ways out of the shutdown and is being trialled at the minute. There are different rules across the UK. Wales's firebreak is still due to end on the 9th of November. Schools will reopen in Northern Ireland tomorrow, and other measures are set to be relaxed in 2 weeks, while Scotland will follow a 5-tier system. The UK R number is thought to be around 1.2. Bringing that down will be just one of the ways of measuring how long this latest lockdown will last. Lauren Moss, BBC News.
Well, the plan to lock down has already forced the government to change its mind about the support package for businesses in England. With me now is our business correspondent, Katie Austin. Katie, the furlough scheme is back.
That's right. Now, many people facing businesses like restaurants and shops who'd already spent money trying to make their premises secure were already struggling under local restrictions. So even though the government is paying more in support, the prospect of a national lockdown was really the last thing they needed. Same goes for the travel industry as well. More furlough will be a great relief, certainly. That'll help at least limit further redundancies, although some firms will have already pulled the trigger on job cuts ahead of the expected end of furlough, which would have been yesterday. Now, the government will fund 80% of the wages for the time workers aren't working. Flexible furlough is allowed, and the business or the worker don't need to have used the previous furlough scheme to qualify. Employers will need to pay national insurance and pension contributions, though. Another form of support on offer for businesses which are forced to close is a grant that can be up to £3,000 over the month, and another form of support on offer is an extension of the mortgage holiday for homeowners who are facing hardship. We haven't heard any fresh support though for self-employed people. We knew there was going to be further winter grants for them if they were eligible, but that was set to be 40% of profits over 3 months. So there are calls for that to be boosted as well.
Katie Austin, our business correspondent, thanks very much. Transport for London, which runs the city's buses and tube trains, has agreed a deal with the government for a further £1.8 billion of emergency funding. TfL has faced a big fall in fare-paying passengers since the start of the pandemic. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, said the agreement wasn't ideal, but would avoid measures such as expanding the congestion charge zone for drivers or ending free travel for under 18s. And if you'd like to know more about the new restrictions and what they will mean for you, you can learn more on the BBC website by visiting www.bbc.co.uk/news. There's more on the stories we've covered on the BBC News channel this afternoon, including a live interview with Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, coming up in a few moments. The next news on BBC One is at 5:35. Goodbye.